Hello everyone, good morning, afternoon, and evening. Thank you for joining. My name is Daniela Gordon. I am from Costa Rica. I work for the Inter-American Institute of Disability and Inclusive Development, IDI, where I am also part of a network of young women with disabilities called La Luz de Frida. Frida slide. The title of today's webinar is No Girls with Disabilities Left Behind, an Intersectional Approach to Education. It is a joint initiative from UNGAI, Humanity Inclusion, Sightsavers, UNICEF, IEP, UNESCO, and is organized as part of UNGAI's Learning Series. We are here today because every child has the right to education. When safe, quality education is available to all, it has the potential to transform our societies and reverse inequalities. However, due to multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination on the basis of gender, identified girls with disabilities face high levels of exclusion from education. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated existing gender inequalities and presented new challenges for inclusive education systems with regards to resources, access, and teaching capacity. Inaccessible remote learning during school closures and increased financial pressures on households mean that many girls with disabilities are at a risk of never returning to school. In light of these unprecedented challenges to gender-responsive and inclusive education, which threaten to roll back on decades of progress, 2021 is a critical year for girls' education. The upcoming G7 Leaders Summit in June and Global Education Summit to finance the Global Partnership for Education in July present key advocacy opportunities to advance the global girls' education agenda. As the global community mobilizes to build back equal, it is critical that girls with disabilities are not left behind. This virtual event will provide a platform for advocacy, learning, and exchange to make the case for inclusive education for girls with disabilities in the lead up to the G7 and the GPE Replenishment Summit. Evidence from Western and Central Africa will be presented by UNICEF, Sightsavers and Humanity Inclusion, leading to recommendations for cooperation, advocacy, funding, and best practice that are applicable to the international level. Speakers representing donor countries, the gender equality in education and disability inclusion in education sectors, and youth advocates will come together to call for more inclusive and gender-responsive education systems, identifying priority areas for action towards intersectionality, gender, and disability in education. Just a quick remark, we are providing simultaneous interpretation in English, French, and Portuguese, so you can select your language by clicking on the world symbol at the bottom of the screen. Captions in English are also provided. Click on the link in the chat box to view the captions in a separate window. Sign language interpretation is also available. Please let us know if you are unable to see the interpreter. As we start today's session, we encourage everyone listening to put their names and where they work in the chat function. Please let us know where you are calling in from and why gender-responsive and inclusive education is important from your perspective. This event, as with any discussion around gender equality, inclusion, and education, must be grounded in the voices and experiences of the boys and girls, women and men who are living these realities. I am pleased to hand over to part one of our video developed jointly with Leonard Cheshire and partners. Girls with disabilities have an equal right to education.
The COVID-19 pandemic has widened inequalities in education, particularly for young women and girls with disabilities. We have 9 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. What governments decide to do now will impact the lives of millions of girls with disabilities. We talked to gender equality and inclusive education advocates, and this is what they had to say. What does education mean for you?
Education has helped me to realize my rights and dreams, without which I wouldn't have been what I am today.
We girls with disabilities need education, which is the key to success, so that we can be who we want to be in future. Education is everything to us and to our lives.
Elimu kwangu ina muhimu kwa sababu inanisaidia kufikia malengo yangu.
Although I have Down syndrome, I have written and published 4 books. This is what going to school means to me.
Going to school meant to me be a normal child, not a child with disabilities only, and not a patient. And that was one of the most important values of education, that it gave me a sense of being equal.
Girls with disability have an equal right to education.
I will now hand over to our first speaker, Alicia Herbert. Alicia Herbert is the Foreign Secretary's Gender and Boy and PCDO Director of Education, Gender and Equalities. Over to you, Alicia.
Thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this event today. My name is Alicia Herbert. I am the Director for Education, Gender and Equality at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and I'm also the UK's Gender Envoy on Gender Equality. We know that children living with disabilities tend to be the last to access education and among the first to drop out. And COVID-19 has exacerbated this problem. Those living with disabilities are at risk of being hit hardest due to the barriers they face in accessing information, their reliance on physical contact with the environment and caregivers, and vulnerability to respiratory conditions caused by certain impairments. The UK is responding. I'll just give a few examples. 1. By recognising that time-bound targets help to galvanise international action, we led a process with G7 partners to devise and adopt 2 new ambitious SDG 4 milestone targets by 2026. And these are intended to get 40 million more girls into school in low and middle income countries, and 20 million more girls reading by the age of 10 or by the end of primary school, also in low and lower middle income countries. We encourage you to get behind those global targets to ensure that we get SDG 4 back on track and that we leave no girl behind. 2. In May, the UK Prime Minister launched the Girls' Education Action Plan. This plan sets out the rationale for investing in girls' education, the scale of the challenge we face, and the action the UK will take to help realise the targets over the course of the next 5 years. We commit to focused support for most marginalised girls, including girls living with disabilities and who are out of school and not learning, drawing on the latest evidence and innovation to extend the reach and impact of all UK aid investments. 3. We will co-host the Global Education Summit with Kenya in London on the 28th and 29th of July to raise funds for the Global Partnership for Education. The summit will convene key global players and decision makers with the aim of getting all children into school and learning. Girls and children living with disabilities will be at the heart of GPE's efforts in coming years. And finally, since the start of the pandemic, we have been flexing our programs to ensure that children, including girls with disabilities, continue to learn. I saw this firsthand on a recent visit to Sierra Leone. I saw how, through our support to the government's radical inclusion education policy, girls with disabilities have an opportunity to access education and to thrive. I would like to thank UNGAI for organising this event and for their continued effort to close the gender gap in education. We are honoured to be part of this partnership. I'd also like to thank the other speakers and panellists for sharing their inputs. As everyone in this meeting already knows, if we want to change the world, girls' education is about the best place to start. I will now pass back to Daniela, and I look forward to hearing from others. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia, for joining us today and for sharing your expertise and insight. We recognize and appreciate the UK's leadership for global girls' education, including education for girls with disabilities. We hope to see continued commitment and support for our shared goals this weekend during the G7 Leaders Summit and reflected in the UK's financial pledge to the Global Partnership for Education in July. I will now hand over to Wongani Taulo to present some key evidence from UNICEF MICS 6 data on education and disability. Wongani is a senior advisor in education, gender equality, and inclusion for UNICEF. You have the floor.
Thank you, Daniela. Just give me a moment to share my screen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to some of you. My name is Wangani Grace Taula, and I'm with UNICEF headquarters working on gender equity and inclusion. I just want to share a perspective in terms of what UNICEF is doing to put on the table data on education for children with disabilities, particularly when it comes to learning outcomes. As you know, UNICEF has a footprint across over 150 countries where we're supporting ministries of education to realize the right to education for all children. And within these, children that are most marginalized are our priority. So we focus on girls and also children with disabilities, but those coming also from the poorest households, but also those in conflict and crisis affected context. My presentation today, we just look at how we are working with partners to put data on children with disabilities on the table, support ministries of education in terms of how they can use this particular data to program and do policy around children with disabilities with a particular focus on gender. As you know, UNICEF is a key leader in terms of the right to education and also just pushing the agenda for the most marginalized population. And in this particular group for children with disabilities, we have a big deficit in terms of data. Just recently, the UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report indicated that many countries actually are not collecting data on inclusion, and most of them do actually not use data even if they have that particular data. And this is quite an acute problem, especially in low and middle income countries where no data is being collected at all on learners with disability. West is still, even where there's some limited data, gender disaggregation and other levels of disaggregation is also a key issue. And what we see is that without this key data, the planning and financing is not actually evidence-based. And this is resulting on a missing opportunity to get learners with disabilities into school, and particularly for girls who actually face multiple forms of discrimination are likely to actually be excluded from education. UNICEF has been working with the Washington group to put this, the child functioning module as part of the multiple indicator cluster survey, which is a key data collection in terms of data on women and also children worldwide. We implement MIX in several of the UNICEF countries, and this is data that is becoming quite critical and key in terms of government planning and decision making, and also informing what policies need to be in place on the right to education. So within this, we have included the child functioning module, starting from MIX 6, which is the recent iteration of the MIX survey, and this is being actually rolled out in several of the countries. What this module actually collects is data around child functioning, so not putting disability as a heterogeneous group, but making sure that we have children assessed in terms of their functionality and looking at how they are performing in terms of learning outcomes. MIX collects data on children aged 2 to 4, that's of course before schooling, and also 5 to 17, which is preschool all the way to secondary school, but also data on child on functioning for adults. The data is disaggregated by gender, location, wealth, age, and also in terms of location, school attendance, but also mother's background, and covers such domains of functionality as hearing, vision, communication, comprehension, learning, mobility, and also emotions. A child is actually considered to have a functional difficulty if their mother or caretaker respond that they have some level of difficulty in a particular domain or are not able to perform a function at all. And children are also considered to have functional difficulty if they have at least one challenge in each of these, in any of these functional domains. We do have gaps in terms of the child functioning module at the moment, in terms of being tested, particularly with teachers, and how this can be used in the classroom setting, but progressively we're going towards that. And also we're looking at functional difficulty, which is not considered as disability per se, but at the same time, mixed data also looks at the population level, and it's not a child level screening tool. And to complement those screening tools are required, as well as linkages to national health and social protection systems, to make sure that we do have those screening taking place in schools, so that data can actually accurately be reported. And also the learning outcomes are actually focused on the population level, and it does not necessarily look at inclusiveness in the education system. By this, we mean that this data also collects information on children who are out of school, but also children who are going to special schools. So it's not really a reflection of inclusivity within those education systems. The data I'm presenting now comes from a number of countries in West and Central Africa who have recently rolled out Mix 6. And what we see is that there are challenges, particularly for children aged 5 to 17 in terms of school attendance. When you look at learners with no functional difficulty in terms of their enrollment and attendance, but also children who have any function difficulty, who are faring less likely to attend school than those with no functional difficulty, and worse still with those with multiple functional difficulties. Not major significant differences between boys and girls, but you can see that girls with any functional difficulty or with any multiple functional difficulties are actually faring a little bit lower when compared to boys, but also when compared to learners with no functional difficulties. When you look at primary completion rate, we're also looking at a similar a graph that also talks to children with no functional difficulty completing at a higher rate compared to children with any functional difficulty, and even more any children with multiple functional difficulties. Girls actually are less likely, well, with the disabilities are less likely to complete primary level, but also, as you see, there are not major significant differences between boys and girls in that regard. When you look at the foundational reading skills for children aged 7 to 14, looking at primary but also lower secondary who are in and out of school, you will see that also girls with any functional difficulty are actually being left behind, whereas girls with no functional difficulty actually perform better than boys, as even global statistics show in terms of reading skills for that particular age group. But as you can see, when you look at children with no functional difficulty at all and compare to children with any functional difficulty or multiple functional difficulties, you also see those glaring disparities where children with any level of functional difficulties are actually left behind compared to those with no functional difficulty. Similarly, when you look at numeracy skills at the same level of children aged 7 to 14 in and out of school, you also see similar outcomes where children with no functional difficulty are doing better than children with any functional difficulty, and also those with multiple functional difficulties. And then also you see the similarities between boys and girls, but of course with girls performing a little bit lower there than the boys, and also than any children with no functional difficulty at all. What this is informing us is that much as we have significant gaps in terms of data on learning outcomes for children with functional difficulties, what we see is also these disparities when it comes to learning outcomes for learners with any functional difficulties, but most critical also when you look at what is happening with the girls, particularly in terms of enrollment, where they are faring worse off than boys with functional difficulties, but also when you compare more broadly with learners without any functional difficulties. We asking for a key actions and also key recommendations, both at the country level in terms of what governments need to do to ensure there's data on learners with functional difficulties, but also particularly when it comes to their learning outcomes. So even beyond access, looking at how learners with any functional difficulties are actually faring in terms of learning outcomes. One, there's a huge capacity gap in terms of understanding of the child functioning module, and this needs to be enhanced so that it can be integrated in policies and also interventions. And also what we're working with various governments is to see how the child functioning module can be integrated into education management information systems so that there's availability of regular data on functional difficulties, so that that can actually inform planning and also become an integral part of sector planning. So we also have guidance in terms of how this child functioning module can actually be integrated into education management information systems. As I indicated earlier, it's also critical to strengthen screening and assessment, especially in the early years, so that the challenges can be identified earlier on. And this comes hand in hand with a strengthening pre-primary enrollment for girls and boys, and making sure that there's that transition from pre-primary or even any other forms of ECD to primary school. So if we have those screening and assessments in place, it means we can work with governments at the systems level to ensure that interventions are put in place to ensure that these children are actually supported throughout the cycle of their education. Critical also to have that disaggregation in terms of gender, but as we know that girls face multiple challenges, multiple vulnerabilities, it's also important to not just look at the gender disaggregation, but also look at other relevant disaggregation, as I indicated, in terms of location, wealth, and also where these children are actually, whether they are in conflict and crisis affected countries, and also other socioeconomic status. And we also need to look at the barriers, analyze barriers critically when we look at the multiple forms of vulnerabilities that girls face. So look at that intersectionality and make sure that we have that important analysis, so this can actually be used to design programs that are actually in compliance with the Universal Design for Learning, so that every child can actually have an equal opportunity to learn, and particularly for girls with disabilities. I'll stop there, Daniela. Thank you.
Thank you, Wangani. Your presentation really underlines the importance of high quality, systematic, and coherent data collection to understand the experiences of girls and boys with disabilities in education, which is critical to inform our advocacy, education sector plans, and policies and programming. We can see that strengthening coordination and collaboration with regards to community stakeholders and the child protection and WASH sectors is really important to ensure that children with disabilities and girls with disabilities in particular are not left behind in education. We will now turn to part 2 of our video to hear from some more young women and girl activists on this topic.
And inclusive.
Education is very important because us young girls with disability need to feel welcomed wherever we are and to get support.
This means access to amazing education for every child with any extra support they may need. Each one of us is different, but we all have an equal right to a good education.
L'éducation est importante pour tous, plus particulièrement les jeunes filles handicapées, qui doivent participer aux instances de décision au même pied d'égalité que les hommes.
An important factor in ensuring no girl is left behind in education is in recognizing we are safer in schools and in controlled learning environments.
More project is focused on girls' child with disability. It will boost their self-esteem and it will reduce stigma and discrimination against girls' child with disability and their vulnerability around violence, rapes, and sexual harassment.
L'éducation inclusive est très importante pour les filles handicapées parce qu'elle prend en compte leurs besoins spéciaux pour un meilleur apprentissage.
When we say that mother girls with disabilities need to have an equal education, we say this because it helps us to become more independent, be a part of the society, and helps us to break stereotypes.
Girls with disabilities have an equal right to education.
I will now pass over to Margot Greenwood, Senior Research Associate for Sightsavers, to deliver our next presentation on qualitative research undertaken by Sightsavers in Sierra Leone, Cameroon, and Senegal.
Hello, it's good to be here with you. I'm going to be speaking on gender and inclusive education participatory research in West Africa. As a brief overview, this research is linked to programmatic projects, one called Education for All in Sierra Leone, funded by the European Commission, and one called Inclusive Education in Cameroon and Senegal, funded by Irish Aid. The research began in 2017 and was due to finish in 2020. Unfortunately, that's now extended to 2022 in 2 of the countries due to COVID-19. These projects they aim to demonstrate a cost-effective way of education, of educating children with disabilities, and have a gender focus. So to look at the research, slide please. What is being asked? And so in the 3 countries, Sierra Leone, Cameroon, and Senegal, we're asking 300 boys and girls with disabilities, their parents, and their teachers via focus group discussions. We're asking what they experience as barriers to participation, what being included and excluded in daily life looks like for them, their successes and challenges, their ideas for change, and how they are experiencing the interventions. Slide, please. The methodology that we're using is community-based participatory research, which involves being committed to sharing the power and resources between researchers, community members, stakeholders who are involved in leading the research. It's about working towards beneficial outcomes for all participants and very much around bringing our unique strengths from everybody and building on those. Slide, please. In terms of data collection and analysis, as I've said, 300 participants across the 3 countries. There were 30 community researchers being trained. These were teachers and parents of children with disabilities, and a third of those had disabilities themselves. They led 48 focus group discussions in 16 schools across the 3 countries, and they were leading those focus group discussions themselves post-training. There were 3 phases of data collection, one at the beginning of the programmatic work, which was often used to help towards building a baseline, partway through the project, and at the end of the project. And everyone was involved in analysis to some extent, so mainly led by researchers, but also involving the community researchers wherever possible. Slide, please. So when we look at findings, there are much broader findings, but we're very specifically looking at gender-related findings. If you'd like to find out more about other findings, there'll be a link at the end of this PowerPoint. In Sierra Leone, in the school and classroom environment, girls were described by teachers as shy or afraid to talk quite often. Boys were regularly described as stubborn, bold, and physically strong. Sometimes girls are seen as more capable academically than boys, and yet in other cases they were described as troublesome, mainly because they were leaving without reason or were not showing up. And there was a feeling in Sierra Leone that girls were in need of a lot of care and information around their menstrual cycle and related hygiene. And in fact, in Sierra Leone, hygiene packs were given as part of the programmatic work. In Senegal, findings were coming out that some believed that the girls were learning faster than boys. For others, they felt that it was more difficult for girls to cope with the challenges of education. So real varied results. In Cameroon, teachers felt that girls were more comfortable to tell their teachers when struggling, and girls themselves expressed receiving help, especially from friends. Boys seemed more reluctant to ask for help, more vulnerable to being left out of school activities, particularly in the playground, things like football. When it came to disruptive behaviour, both boys and girls were discussed. There were more frequent incidents with boys. And in Cameroon, the girls with visual impairments, a few of them spoke of needing low vision devices. And that's because they'd reported that they had to give their assistive device to a boy. They were asked to do so and they didn't get it back. Or for one specific girl, that hers was stolen. Slide, please. A brief look at peer relationships between boys and girls. In Sierra Leone, both boys and girls with disabilities reported suffering from intentional and unintentional unkindness. Girls tended to express that they were being mocked for their handwriting, facial expressions, or equipment that they used, whereas boys were describing that they were being mocked for being slow in their work, or how they moved physically, or how they spoke. In Cameroon, both boys and girls with disabilities expressed fears and stories of violence and sometimes abuse from their schoolmates. Boys tended to report rough physical behaviour, whereas girls were more likely to talk about emotional impact and feeling that there was abuse. And there were also concerns about their safety in the dormitories in one specific school where they were boarding. Slide, please. Quick look at parental and community attitudes. In Sierra Leone, despite equity of rights progress, discriminatory practices in relation to girls persist. Some parents believe that their daughters were of no economic use and their education seemed like a waste of money when money was very short. Several parents felt that the girls were more stigmatized and preferred their daughters to stay at home and to study and still learn, but from home. Through the project, some girls were given additional support in the community, and in a few instances, this provoked some resentment either from boys or their parents, which is since being considered post-research. In Senegal, girls with visual impairments were perceived to be more reliant on others and more attached to their parents. And in Cameroon, girls often talked about sympathetic views in the community more than boys. Not to say that wasn't happening with boys, the boys were simply not talking about it. Emotional difficulties were reported by parents more frequently in relation to boys with disabilities. Slide, please. So to look at some important ways forward. Now these came from the participants themselves. This is something not that Sightsavers has put forward post-research. So this is coming out of the research. So participants were saying that gender and disability intersect in a complex way, and the impact of both needs to be recognised at all stages of an education process. Their key take-home message was stay present to complexity, avoid homogeny. Both disability and gender also intersect with social and cultural contexts. So it's critical not to make assumptions about their impact on education. Therefore, we need to collect context-specific evidence, and that's really important. There are factors that disadvantage both boys and girls with disabilities, and they obviously need to be addressed, such as access to assistive devices, need for family support, transport to school, and issues around stigma. And gender plays an important role in determining children's engagement with education and needs to be taken into account in developing school curricula and school within the school environment. Slide, please. And finally, what does this research add to our programme and global knowledge? So, doing research, this community-based participatory research allows boys and girls with disabilities, their parents and their teachers to shape the ongoing interventions in which they are involved. It empowers community members to contribute and share expertise, decision-making and ownership. There are things that the community members and those the peer researchers, community researchers know that in their context that I don't as a researcher. And finally, it enables teachers, directors and inspectors to draft disability and gender action plans. And in the case of these pieces of the programmatic work, gender action plans were put into place post research and post and as part of the ongoing projects. Thank you very much. At the very end here, that we have a link to the research on our website, and specifically if you'd like the reports in each country, you can flick through and find information there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margot, for the interesting presentation. Participatory research has such a crucial place in building our shared understanding and knowledge around the intersections of gender and disability in education and the diversity of experiences of learners with disabilities, especially as we expect continued pressure on education budgets in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. Keeping cost effectiveness and scalability of interventions top of mind will be really important to continue advancing gender equality and inclusion in education going forward. I will now hand over to our final presentation from Humanity and Inclusion delivered by Valentina Pomato. Valentina is an inclusive education advocacy manager for HI. You have the floor, Valentina.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and good morning or afternoon to everyone. I'm very pleased to share today also some key findings and recommendations emerging from a study conducted by Humanity and Inclusion, the organization I work for. Thank you for the slides. In 3 countries, which are Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. The study indeed looked into how education opportunities are shaped when it comes to educate girls with disabilities, the different challenges, but also what are the perspectives ahead. Next slide, please. So we built here on the study called Being a Girl with Disabilities. It's a research conducted indeed by Humanity and Inclusion with the support of the French Development Agency and NORAD, the Norwegian Development Agency in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. The objective for us of running this research was to learn how gender, disability, and age shape the experiences of girls with disabilities in terms of school access, retention, and educational achievement. We used a qualitative and participatory approach. So the study was carried out through interviews with girls and boys with disabilities, observation of students in special and in mainstream schools, interviews with institutional actors, and focus groups with parents, educational stakeholders, but also religious, community, and associative leaders. The results of the study basically serve to two purposes. On one side, they are going to guide HI's intervention and also its partners' intervention in inclusive education programming. But also the results of this study are used to raise awareness and provide recommendations with the hope that there will be more gender-sensitive, inclusive education policies and programming. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the key findings of our study, and I think that many of the things that I'm going to say really connect very well to what Sightsavers already presented. There are a lot of things that, that emerge that are quite similar. So the first thing that was clearly emerging from this research is that there is a great influence of popular and religious beliefs when it comes to educational opportunities for girls with disabilities. Often disability is seen as a punishment to the family, and it's often also aggravated, especially when we refer to girls with disabilities or girls with severe disabilities in particular. So according to some popular beliefs, the bodies of persons with disabilities have magical properties. And girls with intellectual disabilities are particularly vulnerable to sexual abuse and violence, also because some people believe that having sex with these girls will bring them wealth or power or cure them from HIV. We also experienced that there is lower enrollment rates for girls with disabilities in comparison with their peers. So this is also closely connected to the traditional conception of the social roles of men and women, which of course influences the investment that families and communities make in the education of children. Boys are often seen as the family's future income earners. So we'll have a greater chance of being sent to school, and these will put them on a better path to obtaining paid employment. The cost of educating girls with disabilities are considered too high, not least because of the economic loss this represents. And in fact, girls, including girls with disabilities, often contribute to the economic survival of the household through begging or also by performing domestic chores. When it comes to the age, this is also a factor that clearly emerged as a critical one in the research. There are specific discriminations that many girls with disabilities enroll later in schools in comparison with their peers. But also they are then taken out of school as they approach puberty in order to protect them from possible sexual violence or early pregnancy, for example. So the lack of adequate toilets for girls, including girls with disabilities, and especially during the periods of menstruation, is also a cause of repeated absences and also dropout. Next slide, please. Thank you. If we look also into other findings of the research, we also find out that there is an important impact of socio-cultural and socio-economic factors, especially in rural areas. Living in rural areas can be an additional discriminatory factor for girls with disabilities, an additional barrier to be enrolled and to continue going to school. And of course, a girl with disabilities coming from a family that lives in poverty has less chances to receive education. In rural areas, the distance between home and school was mentioned by respondents to our questions as a major obstacle to the education of girls with disabilities. And for students who walk to school, long distances pose a safety risk, especially for girls with disabilities. The cost of transportation is often too high as well. So when housing solutions near schools are provided, or when there are canteens in schools that offer daily meals, these can actually be factors that can encourage enrollment and stay in school. We also found out that there are specific challenges linked to the type and the degree of disability. Actually, children with a physical impairment in general encounter fewer difficulties for enrollment, but children with moderate or severe intellectual or sensory impairments might require additional educational support, skilled human resources, suitable equipment, which makes more challenging for the system to respond adequately to. And education in special schools for them is very often the only available offer, but also might be very expensive and might also entail a perpetuation of a segregation system. When it comes to gender-based violence, unfortunately, it's pretty well known that violence and abuse, that girls with disabilities are more vulnerable to violence and abuse, both inside and outside schools. However, these remain largely invisible because it's rarely documented. On the other side, programs, structures, and public policies are still insufficient in the countries that we carry the research in to prevent and support girls with disabilities that are victims of rape or of undesired pregnancies. Of course, gender-based violence has a devastating impact on the development and the well-being of girls, and also is a major obstacle to their education. So if we look at the next slide, you'll see there's an infographic that we developed to show how these different factors, all of them, these multiple layers of discrimination, contribute to a persisting form of exclusion of girls with disabilities from education. So the dropout at puberty, stigma perpetuated by popular beliefs, the weak response to the needs of children with severe disabilities, the perception of education as a cost, and the household's poverty and distance from school as well. So on the next slide, I'm going to present just a few recommendations emerged from this research, knowing that we hoped for recommendations that were addressed not only to governments or actors in those specific countries, but also recommendations that might resonate with many other stakeholders also at the global level. So from the governments in the Sahel region, but also in other countries, the main recommendation would be to put in place adequate budgetary means with a gendered approach. We know that the COVID-19 crisis and the economic impact of it is likely to reduce the capacity of government in terms of education financing, but we really hope that domestic financing for inclusive education will be prioritized. It's also very important, echoing what was said before, to develop disaggregated data collection systems. What we confirmed is that there is significant lack of data in regards to children with disabilities and girls with disabilities in particular. We also recommend to collaborate with other interconnected sectors, recognizing that there is a strong need for a multi-sectoral approach to inclusive education, so that the education system should collaborate closely with the health, the rehabilitation, social protection sectors, just to name a few of them. For donors, I think that the upcoming G7 and GPE replenishment are very key opportunities for global donors to strengthen inclusive education and focus also on the education of girls with disabilities. So we call on them to adopt an intersectional perspective and also a twin-track approach in financing, recognizing that there is need to increase financing and to preserve financing from the economic crisis, both looking at strengthening education systems at large, but also adopting a twin-track approach that allows to dedicate specific funding streams for children with disabilities and girls with disabilities. For civil society organizations, so I'm including my organization therein, there's definitely the need to create partnerships, stronger partnerships between gender equality and the disability movements. We need to work together, learn from each other, and practice this intersectionality. And also to continue advocate and hold decision makers accountable vis-a-vis their commitments. And for all stakeholders, it is high time to pursue, strengthen awareness-raising strategies because there's much need to bring this discussion in communities, in schools, with the key actors that are developing educational programming at the local level, and of course with the involvement of organizations of persons with disabilities in priority, but also students, parents. And we also hope that girls with disabilities can be adequately supported to become success models. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valentina. This rounds off the three presentations really nicely. We started with a quantitative picture from UNICEF and then went to hearing from the voices and experiences of children with disabilities, their parents, and lead teachers in education through Sightsavers participatory research, and now have really focused into the intersections of gender, disability, and age, and how these factors and identities shape the experiences of girls with disabilities in terms of school access, retention, and educational achievement. We cannot talk about intersectionality in education without advocating for cross-sectoral collaboration. And I think the sections which highlighted religion, popular beliefs, stigma, and gender-based violence as factors influencing education for girls with disabilities shows just how crucial this will be to ensure no girl is left behind in education. Before we start our panel discussion, we will briefly watch the third and final part of our video. This time we will hear from activists sharing their recommendations to G7 and world leaders for more gender responsive and inclusive education. Take note.
World leaders must invest in education. They have to increase their investment, especially now, and make sure that the education that they are invested in is both disability inclusive and gender responsive for girls with disabilities. This is the only way we can ensure that we do not roll back on our promise to leave no one behind.
Governments and leaders should come forward to establish an equal world where girls and women with disabilities have equal access to education of the 21st century.
We need inclusive education programs, and there must be improved access to technology for girls with disabilities.
To ensure that the girls have equal right to education, the governments can implement the gender equality in the textbooks by hiring experts who would evaluate that.
I urge governments to make their national laws inclusive and adopt inclusive policies on education and gender.
My recommendation is that I want the international bodies to help girls with disability access to free quality education. Girls with disabilities have an equal right to education.
In a critical year for progress towards the right to education for every girl, G7 Summit, GPE Summit, COP26 Summit, we must build back better, equal and inclusive. Girls with disabilities have an equal right to education.
It is so important to continuously ground this discussion in the voices of girls and young women with disabilities. Thank you to all the incredible activists and students who contribute their voice to this advocacy video. To watch it in full, please head to ongai.org. The link will be pasted in the chat box. We will now introduce our panel. This is really an opportunity to build on the presentations we have heard so far and introduce some new speakers to add their insights into the discussion. A warm welcome to MP Honorable Denita Gatti, a member of Kenya National Assembly and the International Parliamentary Network for Education. Raima Mado, and head of the Forum for African Women Educationalists, Regional Office, and Hawa Youth Activist Humanity and Inclusion. My first question is for Ms. Gatti. With the G7 Summit just around the corner, we have seen a considerable increase in political will and rhetoric around girls' education. How can a network like International Parliamentary Network for Education help to translate this political commitment into actions towards inclusive education for girls with disabilities?
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I bring you greetings from Nairobi, Kenya. As a member of parliament, representing persons with disabilities in Kenya's parliament, I want to really say that it is true that girls with disabilities generally are the most excluded group of people when it comes to talking about education, general education. You realize that there are girls with disabilities in this scenario are usually the last to get into a classroom, and they are the first to drop out of a classroom. So there are challenges. So as a member of parliament, personally, living with disability and representing persons with disabilities, for me, I find these are a very good opportunity to really use this opportunity to push for our parliaments and our government to actually fund education. I am very happy, and I know that as a member of the International Parliamentary Network on Education, we have a chapter in Kenya that is basically advocating and pushing forward for our government to continue prioritizing funding for education. As you are aware, Kenya and the UK have been in the forefront. They will in July, the two countries will in July co-host and co-chair the Global Education Summit. And for me, this is an opportunity for ensuring that girls are not left behind, and especially girls with disabilities. The president of Kenya and the UK president, Boris, are extremely key leaders in terms of pushing for these for this kind of discussion. So the International Parliamentary Network for Education, the IPNED, where I am a member, and I am also a member of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, where we are advocating for quality education. You know, we are trying to ensure that SDG 4, which is education for all, is actually a right to every girl. And as you are aware, the agenda for SDGs generally is to leave no one behind. So as a woman member of parliament with disability, I am actually in the IPNED lobbying and ensuring that parliaments across the globe, through the support of the International Parliamentary Association, are actually able to understand the laws and the policy so that we're able to champion. So IPNED basically will play a very important role for me and for many other parliaments in the world in terms of growing and deepening parliamentarians' understanding and commitment to inclusive education. As you are aware, generally and basically, parliamentarians, we as parliamentarians, we have a duty to basically create policies and laws that translate and our political commitment into legislation and inclusive education. So for me, as a member of parliament with disabilities, and as a member of parliament actually within the IPNED consortium, what I want to basically say that in terms of talking about inclusive education, because education, we can never achieve SDG 4, and we cannot achieve the SDGs. We have about 9 years to achieving the SDGs by 2030. You are very much aware that time is really running from our side, and therefore we cannot also talk about education without talking about inclusive education. Girls with disabilities have never had it easy in Africa. They have never had it easy anywhere. They are usually left behind at the expense of boys. We know, and we also understand as members of parliament, because we have raised these questions so many times during COVID-19 to actually find out from our government and hold our government accountable to ensure that the Kenya government and many other governments that we have basically invest in quality, inclusive, and equitable education, including girls with disabilities. We are not short of this. We know very well that the global, the G7 summit is taking place. The Global Education Summit is coming up. The COP26 is coming up. I mean, we have so many summits that are coming up. And as members of parliament under the International Parliamentary Education Network, we want to ensure and ask IPNED, how can IPNED help to build the capacities of members of parliament in our various legislatures to be able to ensure that even when we are doing budgeting for education, it has to ensure that budgeting for education matters must actually have a portion, a serious allocation that goes into inclusive education. Because inclusive education is the only way that our children and our girls are going to be in school. We have put a lot of emphasis around issues of gender. we have noticed that as members of parliament from Kenya, under IPNED, under the CPA, we have noted that we have put a lot of emphasis on gender issues, which is SDG 5. And we now want to ensure that when you're talking about gender equality, how can we as members of parliament bring forward and talk about the intersectionality of gender and disability, so that we are ensuring that no one is left behind.
Thank you. My next question is for Rai. As much as the international community is focused on advocacy and influencing at the head of state world leaders level, we have learned from the presentations which came earlier just how important shifting community attitudes is to overcome barriers to education for girls with disabilities. Can you tell us about the work that Forum for African Women Educationalists is doing to mobilize communities and build public awareness on the value of education, particularly for girls with disabilities?
Thank you very much, Daniela. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me first to thank the organizers for having FAWE on this important topic and event. I'm glad I'm coming after Sightsavers and Humanity and Inclusion, because their presentations have made it crystal clear why it is important to reach out to the communities. At FAWE, we base our work on a two-pronged approach of schooling and empowering. And we also do have a holistic approach whereby we tackle at the same time the different types of obstacles at the level of the girls, the household, and also we simultaneously hold sensitization campaigns and advocacy for policy change, which is equally important, as we just heard from a member of parliament. Now, with our new strategic plan, we built on our long-term experience of community outreach on the social and economic value of girls' education. And we systematically include other dimensions of vulnerability. And as such, we have also expanded our partnership base to reach out to organizations that specialize in working for persons with disability and with persons with disability. To give you just some examples, through the MasterCard Foundation Scholar Program, FAWE was able to provide comprehensive scholarship packages to academically bright boys and girls with disabilities from poor backgrounds. This was being implemented in Ethiopia. And the girls have been trained on the use of braille and provided for hearing aids to ensure that they do not miss out on lessons. And training were given also to the other students. And I'm also glad to see that FCDO is with us, and that Learned Gesture is party to this event, because FAWE, funded under FCDO, is currently working with TVET institutions in partnership with Learned Gesture. And we are targeting girls and young women with disability. In addition to championing for girls' rights, we are highlighting the needs of girls with disability and inclusion in the TVET subsector. Another example I can share with you is the Make Way program, which is funded by the Dutch government, in which, in a consortium of 6 organizations, FAWE is championing intersectionality rights. And the foundational story of that program is of a girl with disability exposed to different forms of violence and denied sexual and reproductive health and rights. So the project has activities that do promote intersectional, we do promote intersectional SRHR within the education system, and we do ensure inclusion of young people with disability. As far as the community mobilization, we do include girls, boys, young men, and young women, but we also do include the parents, the teachers, and the local leaders, with the aim to uniting and make way for the young, as we have called the program. Maybe a last example I could share is the program we are doing in Nigeria under the Gender at the Center initiative, whereby we did reach out to over 2 million community members on gender education and COVID-related messages. Thank you, Daniela.
Now, my next question is for Hawa. When it comes to our campaigns and advocacy at UNGAI, we are hugely supportive of the principle, nothing about us without us. Why is meaningful partnership with youth so important, and how can we work more closely with young advocates such as yourselves to improve education outcomes for girls with disabilities?
Bonjour et bonsoir en fonction de votre position respective. Je suis Mademoiselle Bagia Awa, élève assistante en droits humains. Handicapée visuelle depuis ma classe de 3e, je suis aujourd'hui titulaire d'une maîtrise en sociologie, option éducation et développement. En tant que jeune fille leader et en ma qualité de personne ressource, je contribue depuis 2015 aux missions de la direction en charge de l'éducation inclusive du ministère de l'Éducation nationale en collaboration avec Humanité et Inclusion. Aussi, je suis secrétaire en charge des questions du genre de l'Association burkinabé pour la défense des droits des personnes handicapées. Il faut souligner qu'aucun projet de développement d'une société ne peut revêtir d'un sens complet et parvenir efficacement à ses objectifs que s'il y est intégré des mesures prenant en compte et de manière significative l'implication de la jeunesse, surtout quand il s'agit d'éducation, un sujet qui voit les jeunes et les enfants au centre pour réaliser leurs droits fondamentaux. De ce fait, un partenariat étroit avec les jeunes participe à les mettre en relation directe avec le potentiel qu'ils regorgent et à susciter en eux une prise de conscience indispensable à leur épanouissement et à l'épanouissement de la société tout entière. Par conséquent, pour améliorer la réussite des jeunes et surtout les résultats scolaires des jeunes filles handicapées, il faut, dans tout projet concernant l'éducation et la formation, impliquer les jeunes filles handicapées leaders afin qu'elles puissent transmettre leurs expériences et connaissances aux autres qui, généralement, attendent que le message vienne d'une personne qui suscite en elles l'espoir d'un avenir meilleur. De plus, ces jeunes filles pourraient sensibiliser les éducateurs à la prise en compte des apprenants en situation de handicap dans les établissements scolaires. Et par la même occasion, sensibiliser les camarades valides quant à l'acceptation même de ceux vivant avec le handicap. Et cette stratégie de communication, j'ai dit, pourrait améliorer l'inclusion des jeunes filles et leur donner une estime de soi qui est indispensable pour leur intégration dans la société. Et pour ma seule recommandation, mon appel aux dirigeants mondiaux et aux organisations internationales, je recommande l'institutionnalisation de l'analyse, de la planification et du financement d'un secteur éducatif plus sensible à la question du genre. Ainsi, par le biais des leaders politiques et populaires, ce système pourrait améliorer les relations entre les genres et contribuer à un rendement plus efficace pour tous les apprenants. Il créerait également un espace inclusif adapté aux plus défavorisés. Je vous remercie.
My final question for all three speakers: what is your one recommendation or call to action to world leaders to ensure that no girls with disability is left behind? First, Ray can respond, please.
This is a very important question, Daniela, and I think we all need to commit to walk the talk, and we also need to dare become bolder. For us at FAWE, building back equal will not suffice. And as was said in the video we just saw, we must build back better, equal and inclusive of all in light of the unprecedented disruption to education. And also in light of the rollback of substantial gains we have made over the past decades on girls' education. Promote community awareness about the right of girls with disabilities is key, as well as involve girls with disability, Awa was just telling us about. We must also involve their families in the design of any intervention to ensure that they speak to their context and to their specific needs. I think that we all agree that girls are vulnerable, but girls with disability are even more so. And we need deliberate planning and targeted resources. And now I'm speaking to our member of parliament. We need to have targeted budgets to promote girls with disability education. Budget is important because they are acts, while policies and policy and planning is a declaration of intention. And this is even more relevant in the aftermath of COVID. For education remains a human need and not a privilege. I was mentioning our GCI COVID-19 intervention in the GCI countries. And to say it in the words of Amina, whom we met during our COVID intervention in Nigeria. COVID-19 is a pandemic within my own pandemic of physical disability. This is how she describes her situation. But still, I'm hopeful of becoming a medical doctor one day. This is a word of hope. It does require that all of us, we do commit and we go from policy to action. And I would just maybe end up with this appeal: let us not fail Awa and the millions of girls across the world whose sole goal is to realize their full potential. Thank you very much.
Now the floor is on Ms. Gatti.
Thank you very much. My one recommendation that I would wish as a member of parliament to make is basically to really urge the G7 leaders and the other world leaders to really put the education of girls with disabilities at the center of their strategies and their commitments. Really, we must ensure that girls with disabilities are also able to return to school. They are also able to remain in school, and they are also able to complete school. So for me, really, it is that urgent call that world leaders must really up their commitment to ensuring that we really finance global primary education so seriously that, and this education really must be inclusive. This education must be equitable, and it also must be quality education to ensure that our girls with disabilities are also not left behind as per the SDGs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I will now hand over to our final speaker, Paul Fife. Paul heads the Department for Education and Global Health at NORAD and is joining us today to round off our webinar with some powerful closing remarks. Over to you, Paul.
Knowledge is power, wrote Francis Bacon. This phrase has been adopted by NORAD's Director General and has become the mantra for our agency. This webinar, including this excellent panel discussion, has put forward a solid evidence base. The studies which have been presented conclude that it is crucial to consider intersectionality in education and in international development overall to ensure that no girl with disabilities is left behind. This means strengthening education systems, supporting teachers, finding alternative learning pathways for those that drop out of school, ensuring access to assistive technologies, and not least ensuring safe learning environments that promote human rights, diversity, and tolerance. This webinar has reminded us of the shocking reality of stigma and deep-rooted discrimination facing girls with disabilities. It is so inspiring today to hear from positive role models, showcasing empowered women and girls with disabilities working for the right to quality education and skills which are needed for social and economic empowerment. This is crucial to raise awareness, inspire, and work for change in local communities as well on the global stage. Thank you to all of you. Furthermore, the studies point to the need to work across sectors with health and nutrition, justice, and social protection. We also need to strengthen statistics, ensure robust monitoring systems, and doing more research. It is about learning, but not least about holding ourselves accountable to action and achieving progress for inclusive education. The COVID-19 pandemic has made girls even more vulnerable to learning loss, exclusion, violence, and abuse. A recent report on global education finance shows that 2/3 of low and middle income countries have reduced their education budgets in a period when needs, in fact, have greatly increased. The upcoming global summits, as well as the GPE replenishment in July, are great opportunities to spotlight this and rectify this. Next year, in February 2022, the second Global Disability Summit will take place in Oslo and digitally. As host country, and together with its co-host, the International Disability Alliance and other partners, Norway will follow up on the work done since the first Global Disability Summit hosted by the UK in London in 2018. The summit will bring together developing countries, organizations of persons with disabilities, multilateral agencies, the private sector, NGOs, and donors. On the day prior to the summit, organizations of persons with disabilities and civil society organizations will hold a preparatory meeting facilitated by the Atlas Alliance and the International Disability Alliance. Securing the rights of people with disabilities is a test of our will and ability to uphold the fundamental principle of human rights, namely that all human beings are of equal value, regardless of our abilities. Leaving no one behind is also a foundation principles for the SDGs. Everyone attending today has a role to play in turning inclusive education for children and young people, and not least girls, with multiple marginalization from an aspiration into reality. I wish to thank the United Nations Girl Education Initiative, UNICEF, UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning, Sightsavers, and Humanity and Inclusion for joining forces. Partnerships move this world. See you in Oslo and online in February 2022.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to have you join, and thank you for pulling together this rich and important discussion with your final words. We hope you and everyone watching and listening today will continue to stand with us as we call for gender responsive and inclusive education for all girls and boys. Thank you to our amazing presenters, panelists, and speakers. Thank you to everyone who joined us from around the world. Good morning, afternoon, and evening. Thank you so much.